Your fire alarm can pass its service and your building can still be exposed. And the problem usually isn't the fire alarm. Your fire alarm's been serviced, your CCTV is recording, your access control is working, everything's passed, so why could your building still be exposed? Because quite often, one of those systems has been looked at individually. The fire alarm engineer checks the fire alarm, the CCTV engineer checks the cameras, the access control engineer checks the doors, and everybody signs their bit off and goes home. But who's checking what happens between them? Because in my experience, that's where some of the biggest gaps are. I'm Dan from JKE Fire and Security, and this is the August Resilience Report. And stick with me, because at the end, I'm going to give you 4 questions that you can ask about your own building this week. And if you can't confidently answer all 4, then you've probably got something yourself that is worth looking at. So let's start with your people, because ultimately that's what all these systems are here to protect. You might have heard of the term PEEP, which stands for Personal Emergency Evacuation Plan. And put simply, it's an individual plan for someone who might need assistance getting out of a building during an emergency. And it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has a permanent disability. It could be someone with limited mobility, deaf, hard of hearing, maybe have a visual impairment. Could be somebody with a cognitive condition, or it simply might be someone who's broken the leg and is going to be on crutches for the next 6 weeks. The important part is this: a PEEP shouldn't just be a piece of paper sitting in a folder somewhere. So let's imagine that somebody needs assistance within your company and in an emergency. Who is helping them? What route are they going to take in the event of an emergency? Is there an evacuation chair? Is there a refuge point? If they can't hear the fire alarm, how do they know it's activated? Probably the biggest one: what happens if the person who's supposed to help her isn't at work that day? And that is where the plan becomes real. And there's been an important development this year, because from the 6th of April 2026, the fire safety regulations introduced new requirements for certain residential buildings in England. For buildings that fall within the scope of these regulations, responsible people now have specific duties around identifying the residents who might struggle to evacuate on their own, and they need to offer person-centred assessments and put the appropriate evacuation arrangements in place. Now, that's specifically residential legislation, and I'm not going to pretend that the same regulation applies to every commercial building, because it doesn't. But there is a really important principle here for businesses as well. You need to think about the person and not just the procedure. If you've got staff, visitors, contractors who couldn't follow your standard evacuation plan without assistance, what actually happens when the fire alarm sounds? And have you ever tested it? Because a plan that only works when exactly the right people are in the building just isn't much of a plan. And that brings me on to something else that we see all the time. A building has a perfectly good fire alarm, and everyone assumes that means that the fire safety is good as well. But they are not the same thing. And I say this as someone who installs fire alarms for a living. A fire alarm isn't a fire strategy. It's a very important part of one. But that's what it is, one part. Because you can have a fire alarm that's maintained properly, tested properly, and completely compliant, and still have problems elsewhere in the building. Maybe your fire risk assessment is 5 years old. Maybe you've refurbished half of the building since it was done. Maybe an escape route has slowly become a storage area. Maybe doors have been changed and walls have been moved. Rooms are now being used differently. Or staff just simply don't know what they're actually supposed to do when the alarm activates. These aren't unusual situations because we see them all the time. And here's another one that I think businesses need to understand properly. What happens after your fire alarm sends a signal? A lot of businesses have monitored fire alarms, which is great. But have you actually ever followed the signal all the way through? The detector activates, the panel receives it, the signalling equipment sends it, the monitoring centre receives it, and then what? What information do they have? Who do they contact? What happens during working hours? What happens at 2 o'clock in the morning? And under what circumstances will your local fire and rescue service actually mobilise? Because an automatic fire alarm signal doesn't automatically mean that the fire engine's turning up. Because here in Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, unconfirmed automatic fire alarm calls have been challenged for years. Other fire and rescue services have their own response policies. So don't assume no. And that's the point. You can put smoke into one detector during a service, prove that the detector works. And that is important. But it doesn't necessarily prove the entire chain. We've got the detector, the panel, the signalling, the monitoring. We've got your own procedures, verification, emergency response. So you need to understand the whole journey. We've also got the BS 5839 Part 1 2025 standards, which replaced the previous 2017 edition for non-domestic fire alarm systems. There's changes around things such as the design, the documentation, the responsibilities, the maintenance and newer technology. But even with the latest standards, the principle is still the same. The fire alarm needs to support the fire strategy of the building, not the other way around. But there is another gap that causes problems on larger sites. And this normally becomes obvious when you've got more than one contractor involved. Who actually owns the bit between the two systems? So I get asked this quite a lot. Should we have one company looking after our fire alarm, CCTV, intruder alarms and our access control? And there isn't a universal answer. There's definitely advantages to having one accountable company. You've got one point of contact, you've got somebody who understands the whole site, records can be kept together, and when something goes wrong, you're hopefully excuse me, you're hopefully not spending 3 days listening to 3 different contractors telling you it's somebody else's problem. But there is an important decision. One supplier does not mean one system. Your fire alarm has one job. Your CCTV has another job. Your intruder alarm has another. Your access control, another. They're separate systems for a reason. The key is making sure that they work alongside each other properly. And probably the easiest example is an access control door on an escape route. From a security point of view, we want the door secure. But when certain fire conditions occur, the fire strategy might require that door to release. So you've got 2 systems interacting with each other. And the questions are, who designed that interface? What should the door actually do? Has someone actually commissioned it? Has it been tested? More importantly, who is responsible for maintaining it? Because this is where responsibility can disappear into the gap. The access control company says the readers are working, the fire alarm company says the relay's working, Both systems get a tick, but the door still doesn't release. And that is not resilience. That's two working systems with a failed outcome. And that is exactly what I mean when I talk about the gaps between systems. And the same applies to your monitoring, your automatic doors, your smoke control, your lifts, your intruder signalling, your CCTV networks, third-party interfaces. You need to know what each system is responsible for. Where do they connect? What happens if one fails? Who tests the interface? And ultimately, who owns it? Because good integration could make the responsibility clearer. It shouldn't ever hide it. So 4 questions, and they really aren't complicated. You could genuinely ask yourself about your building this week. Number 1, does our current fire risk assessment reflect the building that we're actually using today? Not the building as it looked 3, 4, 5 years ago. The building today. Have rooms changed? Has the occupancy changed? Has the layout changed? Has anything significant been refurbished? Number 2, is there anybody in this building who might need assistance evacuating? And do we know what would happen? Not, we've got a PEEP in the folder, but could it actually be carried out? And has anybody tested it? Number 3, what happens when our fire alarm activates out of hours? Where does the signal go? Who gets called? What happens next? What information is available? What response are we actually expecting? And if you've got monitoring and nobody can answer that, then please find out. And number 4, this is probably the biggest one. When 2 systems interact, who owns the gap between them? Fire alarm to the access control, alarm to the monitoring station, CCTV to the network, security system to the police response process. Whatever it is, someone needs to own the complete outcome. And if you hesitated on any one of those questions, I'm not saying that your building's unsafe, I'm saying that there's something worth checking, because there's a big difference between having lots of fire and security equipment and having a genuinely resilient building. And I'd much rather find the gap during a planned review than during the emergency itself. And this is exactly why we've started looking at sites through what we call the Verification Gap Audit. Rather than only looking at one piece of equipment, we're looking at what happens across the complete process. Fire alarm arrangements, monitoring and signalling, fire and police response requirements, where relevant, access control interfaces, evacuation arrangements, and the areas where one contractor's responsibility stops and the other one starts. One visit, one clear report, and most importantly, you know where the gaps are. And if that's something that you'd like us to take a look at for your building, then I'll drop our details in the description below. But feel free to give us a call on 0800 254 5645. And if you work in facilities, property, or you're responsible for the fire and security across a business, then please subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to make these videos as useful as possible. No jargon, no scare tactics, just the things that I genuinely feel that you need to know to protect your people and keep your buildings properly secure. So I'm Dan from JKE Fire and Security, creating safer environments for everybody. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.